Everybody needs his memories. They keep the wolf of insignificant from the door. Sal Bellow. Memory. Isn't it a curious thing, capable of transporting you back in time, 20 seconds, 20 minutes, and sometimes even 20 years? This process of recollection, often effortless, sometimes automatic, a veritable time machine that makes it possible to rewind and fast forward our very minds. Yet no matter how vivid what we refer to as memory, all of our mental travel is nothing more than a collection of our present thoughts. We can only live in the moment, an ever-present present. Memory is the glue then that binds your life together. Everything you've ever done, every place you've ever traveled, everyone you've ever known, now and forevermore, a mere biochemical event represented somewhere in your brain. You see, our memory, like our perceptions, is a function of our neural system, capable of playing tricks. In this way, memory may be thought of as another word for a story, a strange and wonderful story, a story that is being written and rewritten throughout our lives. Nostalgia is the best liar I know, and memory is the most unreliable narrator. Yet as integral as memory is to creating the very person you are, the act itself of remembering is not completely trustworthy. Writer Stephanie Collis puts it beautifully. Memory, she says, uncorrected, uncorroborated, and by its very nature unreliable, is what allows us to retroactively create the blueprints of our lives, because it's often impossible to make sense of our lives when we're inside them, when the narratives are still unfolding. Unlike a recording device, memory is neither as accurate or reliable, incapable of allowing one to reproduce a permanent record of his lived experiences. For more than 100 years of systematic research in this area of memory, scientists today seem to agree on one thing, that memory is more like an interpreter, active in both the process of creating or constructing and recreating or reconstructing past experiences. Thought of this way, our memory has much less fidelity than any recording technology, is much more slippery and malleable, conveniently bending to our unique understanding of the world and twisting like a pretzel to accommodate our biases, colored like an artist's canvas by the circumstances in which we remember. Nothing spoils a good story like the arrival of an eyewitness. Mark Twain. Mark Twain, like most before and many after him, believed that the only thing better than a good story is hard evidence. For most of human history, the hardest, most powerful evidence one could produce would be that of an eyewitness. And while still very compelling in the court of law today, research over the past 2 decades has cast a significant shadow of doubt over the reliability and accuracy of these eyewitness firsthand accounts. American author Lisa Unger. But did you know that eyewitness testimony is often totally unreliable? The human memory only records events through the filter of its own frame of reference. We try to fit the information we receive into schemas or units of knowledge that we possess about the world that corresponds with frequently encountered situations, individuals, ideas, or events. In other words, we often see things as we expect them or want to see them, and not always as they are. You don't need to be a memory expert, though, or have a memory researcher tell you that this is not a good thing. At the intersection of how we remember and what we remember sits a complex array of contradictory circumstances. Harvard professor of psychology and author of the important book on human memory, entitled The Sins of Memory, explains.
Hey, I'm Daniel Schachter. I'm a psychology professor at Harvard University here in the Department of Psychology, where I've been studying various aspects of memory for the past 25 years since landing at Harvard. One of the things that's always interested in me about memory has to do with why it is that memory can sometimes go wrong. Why is it that our memories are subject to forgetting and to distortion? And about 15 years ago now, I wrote a book called The 7 Sins of Memory, where I set out to try to see whether there were basic categories of memory errors. And I came to the conclusion that there were 7 fundamental types of memory errors. And by analogy, I talked about them in relation to the 7 deadly sins, and so I called them the 7 sins of memory.
So Dan Schachter argues that we remember and forget for some of the same reasons. These reasons he classifies into 7 individual sins, as it were. And these sins, he believes, can be categorized further into 2 categories, one of omission and the other of commission. Now, this contrast between what it feels like to remember something versus the veracity of the memory itself is at the heart of what makes memory so compelling on the one hand, yet so flawed on the other. I mean, just consider the following.
My work has made me different from most people. Most people cherish their memories, know that they represent their identity, who they are, where they came from. And I appreciate that. I feel that way too. But I know from my work how much fiction is already in there. If I've learned anything from these decades of working on these problems, it's this. Just because somebody tells you something and they say it with confidence, just because they say it with lots of detail, just because they express emotion when they say it, it doesn't mean that it really happened. We can't reliably distinguish true memories from false memories. We need independent corroboration.
I'd like you to play a game with me. I want you to imagine that you're going to witness a crime. Now, unlike most crimes, you know ahead of time that this is about to happen. You're therefore, or at least you should therefore, be at an advantage. In a few seconds, a series of words will begin to appear on the screen, and they'll remain on the screen for a very short amount of time. So please, pay close attention and try to remember what you see. Okay, now I'd like to interview you. As is the case following most crimes, potential witnesses are usually questioned. I'd like to show you another list of words uncovered throughout my investigation of this crime to see if your memory of any of the words can be corroborated with recollections of the memories of other witnesses that I have interviewed. I'm about to show you several words. What I want you to do is compare each of these to your memories of the words that you just saw when I asked you to be a witness to a crime. I'll follow up each one by asking you to do 2 things. First, I'd like for you to ask yourself whether or not you've seen the word I'm about to show you or not. Secondly, I'd like for you to think about how confident you are as to whether you've seen this word or not. That is, was this word part of the original list? Okay, here is your first word. Do you remember seeing this word in the original list? Think carefully. And whether you do remember or do not remember seeing it, I'd like you to think about how confident you are in that memory. Okay? Word number 2. Do you remember seeing this word or not? And on a scale from 0 to 100%, how confident are you that you either remember seeing it or do not remember seeing it? And here's the third word. Same questions apply. Do you remember seeing that word from the original list or not? And how confident either way are you, from 0% to 100%? And finally, fourth word. Do you remember seeing that word on the list? Yes or no? And how confident are you, from 0 to 100%? Now what I'd like to do is for us to check our work. Let's take a look at the words I just asked you to compare. Lamp, drowsy, clock, and sleep. And now, I'd like to show you the original list. Wow. Where is sleep on that original list? How in the world did this happen? What's going on? You see, memories are arranged throughout your brain in a series of networks. The people, the places, the things, the words, the feelings, etc., that are part of you are organized by various levels of association. And while it is true that ultimately what makes memory so flexible is in large part these semantic networks, as it were, it is these series of interconnected nodes or networks that also makes memory so biased and so tenuous and precarious. By now you may be thinking, what does this have to do with real life? How does a word game like this relate to the circumstances surrounding an actual crime involving real people? Let's take a look.
It's a cliche of courtroom dramas. That moment when the eyewitness is asked, "Do you see the person who committed the crime here in this courtroom before you?" Well, it happens in real courtrooms all the time. And to jurors, that point of the finger by a confident witness is about as damning as evidence can get. It was hot and humid in Burlington, North Carolina on the night of July 28, 1984. Jennifer Thompson, then a 22-year-old college student, had gone to bed early in her off-campus apartment. As she slept, a man shattered the light bulb near her back door, cut her phone line, and broke in. Her first thought was to offer him anything she had to go away.
You can have my credit card, you can have my wallet, you can have anything in the apartment, you can have my car. And he looked at me and said, "I don't want your money." And I knew what was getting ready to happen.
She vowed to stay alert and study him so that if she lived, she could help put him away forever.
What is his voice? Does he have an accent? Does he have a scar? Is there a tattoo?
He's raping you and you're studying his face.
And it was just trying to pay attention to a detail that if I survived, and that was my plan, I'd be able to help the police catch him.
After about half an hour, Jennifer tricked the rapist into letting her get up and fix him a drink, and she ran out the back door. Detective Mike Galden met Jennifer at the hospital.
The first comment I remember her making was that, "I'm gonna get this guy that did this to me." She said, "I took the time to look at him. I will be able to identify him if I'm given an opportunity."
Detective Galden worked with Jennifer to make a composite sketch, poring over eyes, noses, ears, lips, trying to recreate the face she had seen that night. The sketch went out, and tips started coming in. One of those tips was about a young man named Ronald Cotton, who worked at a restaurant near the scene of both rapes and had a record, a guilty plea to breaking and entering, and as a teenager to sexual assault. 3 days after the rape, Mike Galden called Jennifer in to do a photo lineup. He laid these 6 pictures down on the table, said the perpetrator may or may not be one of them, and told her to take her time.
I can remember almost feeling like I was at an SAT test. You know, we start narrowing down your choices. You can discount A and B. And
Oh, like multiple choice.
Exactly.
According to the police report, Jennifer studied the pictures for 5 minutes.
She picked up Ron's photograph and said, "That's the man that raped me."
And you must have said, "Are you sure?" And she said yes?
Yeah, oh yes, certainly.
Ronald Cotton heard the news from his mother's boyfriend.
He told me, "Sir Ron," he said, "the police are looking for you." And I said, "For what?" He told me, "For rape." I said, "Man, I can commit such a crime like that."
He was locked up and days later put in a physical lineup.
I'm number 5.
And then she knew it was number 5, Ronald Cotton.
Did you feel absolutely certain?
Absolutely certain.
When they ask you, do you recognize the man who did this to you? Did you point to him? It was
Absolutely.
Ron Cotton.
It was Ronald Cotton.
She called my name, pointing a finger, and that's all it takes, it seemed like.
What did that feel like?
It felt like someone pushing a knife through me.
It took the jury just 40 minutes. The verdict, guilty on all counts.
He was sentenced to life and 50 years. And it was for me that moment that you know the justice system works.
Ronald Cotton was handcuffed, shackled, and taken to North Carolina's Central Prison. He was 22 years old. Then a fellow inmate told him that he'd heard Bobby Poole admit to raping Jennifer and the other woman that night. Ronald Cotton won a new trial, and his lawyers called Bobby Poole to the stand with Jennifer sitting right there. It was the moment Ronald Cotton had been hoping for.
Bobby Poole is in the courtroom. You look over there. What happens inside you?
Nothing.
Nothing.
Nothing. As a matter of fact, the strongest emotion I felt was anger at the defense. Because I thought, how dare you? How dare you question me? How dare you try to paint me as someone who could possibly have forgotten what my rapist looked like? I mean, the one person you would never forget? How dare you?
Ronald Cotton was convicted again, this time given 2 life sentences. Packed away on the shelves of the Burlington Police Department was 10-year-old evidence from the 2 rapes that night. Inside one of the rape kits was a fragment of a single sperm with viable DNA. It proved what Ronald Cotton had been saying all along. He was innocent, and the rapist was Bobby Poole. Within days, Ronald Cotton was back in court.
You are walking out here today as a free man.
This time to be released.
So not only do you find out that Ron didn't do the crime, you find out Bobby Poole did.
It was just utter shock, really, disbelief. I mean, by this time, this is 11 years later. And, you know, I know that I've been involved in a case of a man who's lost 11 years of his life. And I was so sad for him and his family. Her reaction, no, it can't be true. It's not possible, you know. I know Ronald Cotton raped me. There's no question in my mind.
It was like someone had just taken my life and like turned it upside down.
She cried?
Oh, she cried. She broke down. I mean, she took it all on herself. You know, the guilt. You know, I did this to that man.
Shame?
Shame, terrible shame. Suffocating, debilitating shame.
But when she thought or dreamed about that night, it was still Ronald Cotton's face she saw. How is it that Jennifer could have studied her rapist so carefully and still made this mistake? And how could she have failed to recognize Bobby Poole, the actual rapist, when he sat right in front of her in the courtroom 3 years later? Now that DNA has exonerated more than 230 men, mostly in sex crimes and murder cases, criminologists have been able to go back and study what went wrong in those investigations. What they've honed in on is faulty eyewitness testimony. Over 75% of these innocent men were convicted in part because an eyewitness fingered the wrong person. At the heart of the problem is the fragility of memory.
Before this case, did you think that there were a lot of innocent people put away?
No.
You didn't?
No, I didn't. Innocent people aren't convicted of crimes they didn't commit. I believe that.
What do you think now?
Oh, I know better. I mean, well over 200 cases nationally. We've had a half a dozen in this state alone. The first, of course, was my case.
Hallelujah! And as these innocent men have been freed in one state after the next, we've learned something else, that in all the cases where eyewitnesses were wrong, the real perpetrator was not in the initial lineup.
When you're sitting in front of a photo lineup, you just assume one of these guys is the suspect. It's my job to find it.
And Jennifer did her job. She found the suspect's photo. Problem is, the suspect, Ronald Cotton, was not the rapist.
Bobby Poole's photograph was not in the photo lineup.
Right.
He was not in the physical lineup.
When the real perpetrator is not in the set, is none of them, witnesses have a very difficult time being able to recognize that.
Gary Wells, a professor of psychology at Iowa State University, has been studying eyewitness memory for 30 years. He says when the real guy isn't there, witnesses tend to pick the person who looks most like him.
I think that Ronald Cotton and Bobby Poole look very much alike. They have very similar lips, shape of their eyes, their eyebrows kind of go up in a look of surprise.
Yes. Without him in the lineup, Ronald Cotton was the one who was in jeopardy.
Wells says eyewitness testimony has two key properties. One, it's often unreliable, and two, it is highly persuasive to jurors.
I can see why it's so persuasive. Someone says, I was there. You'd believe that person.
You believe that person because they have no reason to lie.
Yeah.
The legal system is set up to kind of sort between liars and truth tellers, and it's actually pretty good at that. But when someone is genuinely mistaken, the legal system doesn't really know how to deal with that, and we're talking about a genuine error here.
He walked us through what went wrong, some of it counterintuitive. When Jennifer spent 5 minutes studying the photographs, she and Detective Galden thought she was being careful.
I didn't want to come across, I don't think, as somebody who was like, that's the one. I really wanted to be sure.
Wells says no good.
Recognition memory is actually quite rapid. So we find in our studies, for example, that if somebody's taking longer than 10, 15 seconds, it's quite likely that they're doing something other than just using a reliable recognition memory.
So you're saying if she really recognized the guy, it would have been almost instantaneous.
Quite quick, yes.
He says a better way would have been to show Jennifer lineup photos or people one at a time, so that she would compare each one directly to her memory rather than to one another. Wells says in real life, the mistake is often compounded by what happens next. Remember the seemingly innocent information Jennifer says she got from police after she picked Ronald Cotton out of the physical lineup?
That's the same person you picked out in the photo lineup. So in my mind, I thought, bingo, I did it right.
He says the solution is to have someone independent administer the lineup, someone who doesn't even know who the suspect is. Elizabeth Loftus is a professor of psychology and law at the University of California, Irvine, and an expert in memory. She showed me an experiment she says might help explain Jennifer's mistake. She asked me to study these faces. Then, after a few minutes, she gave me a memory test.
Which of these two faces do you recognize?
Right.
Okay, you picked right.
Left.
You picked left. Okay.
And I said left, but I wasn't 100% sure.
And then, the tricky part.
Oh. Well, I'll tell you why I'm stymied. Because I just picked this one on the left 2 seconds ago. But now I'm not sure, because those two look very much alike to me. But I'm going to tell you the left.
But I was wrong. It was the one on the right. Loftus explained how I had been duped.
You saw this face, then I gave you a test where I presented you with an altered face, along with a novel one. So I pretty much induced you to pick a wrong face because I don't even have the real guy there. It's an altered version. And later on, when you now have a choice between the altered one and the real one, you stuck with your altered left choice.
This is exactly what happened to Jennifer.
This can help us understand why Jennifer can be sitting in a courtroom and be looking at Bobby Poole, the original rapist, and looking at Ronald Cotton and saying, no, it's not Poole, it's Cotton, because she has been picking him all along.
Jennifer and Ron say they speak on the phone about once a week. They're families of friends. They say they have a shared bond that is hard for most people to fathom.
Have people ever met you for the first time when you're together and said kind of cheerily, hey, how did you two meet?
Yeah.
They
We
have?
did it on the airplane a lot.
Oh, yeah.
We're traveling. And I usually just go, you tell them.
Well, what
You
do
know.
you say?
We would look at each other and laugh, and finally we go ahead and
And tell them.
and they have recently co-authored a book in hopes that their story can inform and inspire others.
The story of Ronald Cotton and Jennifer Thompson is a poignant and very important one. But more than this anecdote, this story actually represents a larger issue surrounding the criminal justice system and eyewitness testimony. You see, there are some known reasons for why witnesses get things wrong. Emotion, contrary to popular belief, might actually blind you to some of the details that you would ordinarily or otherwise remember about a situation, a person, or a circumstance. Likewise, if the person you are witnessing is of a different race or ethnicity than you, the witness, then we have to be concerned about what researchers now call the cross-race identification problem, the tendency for white Americans to have trouble differentiating the faces of Hispanic or African Americans, and vice versa. And of course, there's also the issue of contamination. As the famous memory researcher Elizabeth Loftus so clearly and poignantly points out.
There's a common lay belief that memory works like a recording device. You just record the experience and later on you play it back. But that is not the way memory actually works. Memory is actually more of a constructive process. When we remember something, we're actually taking bits and pieces of experience, bringing them together to essentially construct what feels like an actual memory. So I like to say that memory works a little bit more like a Wikipedia page, because you can go in there and edit it, but so can other people. If you ask somebody, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? You're going to get a higher estimate of speed on the average than if you ask a question with a more neutral verb like hit. How fast were the cars going when they hit each other? The early questions could affect the answer that people gave to some totally different question that you put to them often much later. So if I ask you how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other, later on you're more likely to tell me you saw broken glass at the scene, even though there wasn't any broken glass. These leading questions, they contain misleading information that can contaminate a person's memory. We get contaminated when we talk to other witnesses, when we're interrogated in a suggestive or leading manner. We get contaminated if we've seen a high publicity event and then we see some newspaper or television coverage about that event. All of these situations provide an opportunity for new information to enter a witness's memory and cause a contamination, transformation, distortion, or even just a supplementation of the memory. So what the scientific work on memory distortion is revealing about the nature of memory is that it is malleable. It's not something that's fixed. It's subject to distortion or change or exaggeration, and that's why we talk about the malleable nature of memory. But when it comes to somebody's liberty, even very small errors in memory can make a really big difference about somebody's freedom. So it matters what the color of the jacket of the perpetrator or the facial hair or other things that people are trying to remember when they try to remember a past crime. Many people are just not aware of how many mistakes people can make, and when they are making a mistake and they're testifying, they can often be very detailed and very confident and even emotional in their testimony. We began to study this process, and one of the first studies that I did involved using the power of suggestion to get people to believe and remember when they were 5 or 6 years old, they were lost in a shopping mall with certain family members present in a certain place. And we used suggestive interviewing to plant these memories, and we got about a quarter of otherwise healthy adults to believe and remember all or part of this made-up experience. There is now a string of experiments using this kind of lost in the mall technique where ordinary people have been led to believe that they nearly drowned and had to be rescued by a lifeguard, that they were attacked by a vicious animal, that they committed a crime as a teenager, when none of these things actually happened. And so we now refer to these as rich false memories. You can plant a little seed, and through the power of suggestion, it can grow into something very big and rich and detailed.
Eyewitness testimony is not 100% reliable, and that confidence in a person's memory does not necessarily equate to veracity. Yet, it is nevertheless compelling to both juries and judges in courts of law. And it appears as though, from the research, Loftus and others have found that with more time passing by, most witnesses' memories become entrenched. That is, they become more convinced by their own memories than less. Elizabeth Loftus argues at the most fundamental level, memories are constructions and reconstructions. They're malleable, they're flexible, but they're not reliable.